Is 8 gigs of VRAM enough for a gaming laptop? Or should you spend more to get 12 or 16 gigs? These two gaming laptops are exactly the same in every way except for one. This one has 8 gigabytes of VRAM, while this one has 16 gigabytes of VRAM. And this is important because if you run out of VRAM while playing a game, you'll either get worse performance, lower texture quality, or both. In other words, a worse gaming experience. Because VRAM is the fast memory that the GPU has direct access to, and when that runs out, it has to start using slower system memory. So I've tested 8 and 16 gigs of VRAM in games at 4K, 1440p, and 1080p resolutions to find out if 8 gigs is enough. But there aren't any laptop GPUs from Nvidia's RTX 40 series with different amounts of VRAM. The RTX 4070 is limited to 8 gigs of VRAM, so you've got to spend more for the RTX 4080 if you want 12 gigs, or even more money for the RTX 4090 if you want 16 gigs. But if we go back to last generation, Nvidia's RTX 3080 was available with either 8 gigs or 16 gigs of VRAM, and I've got both in these two Aorus 15p gaming laptops. They're exactly the same. Literally, the only difference is the VRAM. The performance from the RTX 3080 is very similar compared to all of the RTX 4070 results that we've ever tested. It almost falls right in the middle, so we can basically pretend that the 8GB 3080 is the same as an 8GB 4070. The GPUs are otherwise the same, with the same CUDA core count, core clock and memory clock speeds, and both laptops have the same CPU, RAM, SSD, cooling, BIOS, drivers, Windows updates, and power limits. Everything is identical except for the VRAM, which means a perfectly fair comparison. And this will let us see once and for all if Nvidia should have given the RTX 4070 laptop GPU more than 8 gigs of VRAM. Alright, let's get straight into the games. I want to start out with Alan Wake 2, as I've found it to be quite heavy on VRAM usage. This graph shows how much VRAM was used at 1080p, 1440p, and 4K resolutions. The dark purple bars show allocated VRAM, which is how much is set aside for use by the game, while the lighter bars show dedicated VRAM, which is the actual VRAM being used by the game process. And I only recorded this on the laptop with 16 gigs. At 1080p, we're only just tipping over the 8 gig limit with high settings and ray tracing set to low. But if we look at the actual FPS being hit at 1080p, both laptops were performing about the same, and only running at around 30 FPS with the lowest quality ray tracing option enabled. In these FPS graphs, I've got the laptop with 8 gigs of VRAM shown by the red bars, and the laptop with 16 gigs of VRAM shown by the purple bars. And yeah, at 1080p, the differences are only minor, as this resolution isn't heavy enough to use more VRAM. But at 1440p, we can see that all setting levels except for low are using more than 8 gigs of VRAM. And we can see that most of the 8 gig results in red are now behind the 16 gig results in purple. The gap in average FPS isn't that big. Most of the difference is seen in the 1% lows, which represent the dips in performance. This game was stuttering a bit more on the 8 gig GPU because there isn't enough VRAM. The frame rates here aren't particularly high at around 40 FPS at high settings, but it was still playable and felt better on the 16 gig laptop. The difference only appears minor if we stick them side by side. The 8 gig laptop on the left isn't allocating as much VRAM, but there's not too much difference in the frame time graph. And then both of them run like garbage with ray tracing set to low, despite the 16 gig laptop having more VRAM to offer. And that's because the GPU itself isn't powerful enough for this to be a good time. By the time we get up to 4K, every setting level is demanding at least 8 gigs of VRAM, with as much as 12 gig needed to run high settings with ray tracing set to low. Of course, that doesn't mean much when the game runs like a slideshow on either laptop. And that description isn't too far off what we get from the rest of the setting levels at 4K either. Yeah, the 16 gig GPU is running the game better, both in terms of average FPS and 1% lows, but realistically, you wouldn't be running this game at 4K without some upscaling anyway, which would reduce the VRAM requirements a bit. Before we get into the next game, we need to discuss how my experiment of using the RTX 3080 kinda fails. RTX 30 series GPUs cannot use Nvidia's DLSS 3 frame generation. Only 40 series and newer get access to that feature. And that's worth considering, because if we look at these results from Hardware Unboxed, we can see that an enabling frame generation increases the amount of VRAM used. So if you are planning on using features like frame generation, then you'll have to assume that you're going to use a bit more VRAM than what I'm showing in this video, because these 3080s are not able to run Nvidia's frame generation. But there's still AMD's FSR frame generation, which runs on these GPUs, so let's check that out next. Starfield shows us that extra VRAM is used when enabling FSR frame generation, only an extra 100 megabytes at 1080p or 300 megabytes at 1440p, but an extra gigabyte is used at 4K. Though at 4K max settings, it's not even allocating more than 8 gigs of VRAM even with frame generation, so VRAM isn't the limit in this game. The latest version of Cyberpunk 2077, on the other hand, demands more VRAM. At 1080p, we're just barely tipping over the 8 gig limit with the Ray Tracing Ultra preset. Frame generation used less VRAM here because I combined it with FSR set to balanced, as the frame rate was too low to make frame generation alone a good experience. Like Alan Wake 2 earlier, ray tracing was only running at like 30 FPS on these laptop GPUs, so it makes sense to use these features to help improve performance. At 1440p, we're still only seeing above 8 gigs of VRAM in use once we start using ray tracing. And yeah, the laptop with 16 gigs of VRAM was performing better with the Ray Tracing Ultra preset. But let's be real, the VRAM isn't what's stopping you playing at these low frame rates. The GPUs just aren't powerful enough. Interestingly, once we enabled FSR upscaling and frame generation, the 8GB laptop was a little ahead, despite this test apparently demanding almost 9 gigs of VRAM, so it's possible that there might be some texture cycling going on. More on that shortly. I also want to point out that in most games, for reasons I can't explain, the 8GB VRAM laptop in red was usually slightly in front of the 16GB VRAM laptop when VRAM was not a limit. I retested both laptops and consistently replicated this in most games. I'm guessing it's Silicon Lottery luck, because both laptops are essentially the same except for the VRAM capacity difference. Anyway, if we step up to 4K, high and ultra settings allocate more than 8 gigs of VRAM, but this doesn't actually mean that it's in use. Sure enough, there's no major difference to frame rates at these setting levels, but the 8GB laptop gets absolutely destroyed with the Ray Tracing Ultra preset at 4K. But at just 10 FPS, it's not like the 16 gigs of VRAM is saving the other laptop. We just run out of raw GPU power before VRAM becomes too much of a limitation in this game. In this side-by-side comparison, we're looking at the Ray Tracing Ultra preset with FSR 3 set to balanced mode and frame generation enabled. Basically, a worst-case scenario for VRAM usage that's not a complete slideshow. Although we're only getting 30 to 40 FPS best case, the frame time graph is much smoother on the 16GB laptop. Actually, the 8GB laptop completely choked in this screen capture, way harder than it did when I was actually measuring FPS. So not sure if it just couldn't take the extra load from OBS or what. But for the most part, when we're not messing with ray tracing, Cyberpunk was getting by okay with only 8 gigs of VRAM. And it's not the only popular game where VRAM is less of an issue. In Black Myth Wukong, I never even saw 8 gigs allocated, even at 4K with the highest cinematic preset. Of course, you could argue that this is because I've set DLSS to a resolution scale of just 50% at 4K and 75% at 1440p. But if we look at the actual frame rates, at 4K, I personally wouldn't want to play with anything above high settings, as there's just too much of a compromise to the frame rate. And well, I'm not a console player, so 30 FPS is out for me. I relied less on DLSS upscaling at 1440p with the resolution scale set to 75%, where high settings gets us around 60 FPS. But again, there's no major difference seen to frame rates as VRAM is not a limit. Just the weird thing where the 8GB laptop was slightly ahead in every test. And we're still getting a similar 60 FPS at 1080p high settings with the resolution scale set to 100% this time. So basically no upscaling. Of course, I could use a low resolution scale to bump up the FPS even more at higher setting levels, but that would likely reduce the VRAM usage, as we're upscaling from a lower base resolution. Of course, different parts of the game will use more or less VRAM. It depends where you are in the game and what's going on. I played the games for about 10 minutes before recording any FPS data to fill the frame buffers up a bit, but it's definitely possible that it might fill up more throughout a longer gaming session. Unfortunately, it just gets to the point where there's only so much testing I can do. I wish I had unlimited time, but I don't. Initially, I thought that Black Myth Wukong, a new popular resource-heavy game, would use more than 8 gigs of VRAM. Surely I must just be doing something wrong. But then I found this clip from Hardware Unboxed discussing exactly this.
But the simple reason with this game is that the texture quality isn't that good. Yeah, it makes sense why this uses less than 8 gigabytes of VRAM.
So that just seems to be how this game is. There are plenty of other games where 8 gigs of VRAM is perfectly sufficient, like Forza Horizon 5, where we're just under the 8 gig limit at 4K with the highest extreme setting preset. 4K max setting still gets you around 60 FPS and is playable, at least compared to the other games tested, where GPU power becomes a limit before VRAM. This game runs very easily, and higher settings would only be an issue with lower tier GPUs that have 6 gigs of VRAM, like the RTX 3050 or 4050 laptop GPUs. That's not the case in Hogwarts Legacy, which is well known for being a VRAM hog. At 1080p, we're just going above 8 gigs of VRAM used at ultra settings, while setting ray tracing to ultra and making use of DLSS pushes us closer to 9 gigs. This game has DLSS frame generation for 40 series and newer, but not FSR frame generation. So expect more VRAM used with FrameGen. At 1080p, the laptop with 16 gigs of VRAM was reaching a slightly higher frame rate at both of these setting levels, though there's a bigger 15% boost seen in the 1% lows at ultra settings. This isn't really a huge difference in terms of performance, but 16 gigs of VRAM was performing better. At 1440p, it's still only ultra and above where more than 8 gigs of VRAM was needed. The laptop with 16 gigs of VRAM performed a bit better here too. Again, it's not a massive lead, but it is a clear win, and a more noticeable gap compared to the lower setting levels where VRAM was not a limit. So this demonstrates performance left on the table by Nvidia not giving the 4070 more VRAM. In fact, it's the same story at the higher 4K resolution too. High settings allocates 8.5 gigs of VRAM, but the game process was actively using 7.2 gigs during my testing. This is why there's no FPS difference at 4K high settings or below. There is, however, a larger gap at ultra settings now. The frame time graph just isn't as consistent with the 8 gig laptop on the left. The 16 gig laptop on the right is clearly smoother and a better experience. But at the same time, given the game is only running around 30 FPS, you'd be more likely to either lower the setting levels, resolution, or make use of DLSS upscaling, all of which would reduce the amount of VRAM used. But what about differences to visual quality? It's not all just about FPS. Once the VRAM buffer fills up, textures might start popping in and out of the game, which is just distracting and annoying. Not to mention, it just makes the games look like crap. And this is something I've seen demonstrated by other channels like Hardware Unboxed. Granted, this was captured 18 months ago. It's possible Hogwarts Legacy has gotten better in this regard since then. And I'm wondering if that's the case, because in my side-by-side comparison, I wasn't seeing textures randomly disappearing and reappearing on the 8 gig laptop at 4K ultra settings. And I do remember this happening in the past, but I'm not exactly a pixel peeper, so feel free to pause the video and decide for yourself, at least as best you can with YouTube's video compression. Honestly, I expected to see a bigger difference between 8 and 16 gigs of VRAM before going into this testing, but it turns out that in many cases, these laptop GPUs simply aren't powerful enough for it to really matter. Maybe it would be different if I tested with more than 6 games, but this testing on 2 laptops at 3 resolutions at all setting levels already took me the best part of a week. There's only so much I can do. Yeah, some games definitely do see a benefit with 16 gigs of VRAM, like Alan Wake 2 at 1440p, which was capable of playable frame rates on our laptop GPUs. But in many other cases, by the time 8 gigs of VRAM is used, the frame rates are so low that it doesn't matter. You wouldn't want to play with those settings anyway. So for gaming laptops specifically, I think that 8 gigs of VRAM is less of an issue compared to what we see on the desktop side from channels like Hardware Unboxed, who test with more powerful desktop CPUs and GPUs. Now, don't get me wrong, their videos clearly show that 8 gigs of VRAM just doesn't cut it anymore for modern gaming at at 1440p, with 12 gigs being a better sweet spot. But laptop GPUs just aren't as powerful. Take the RTX 3070 Ti desktop graphics card with 8 gigs of VRAM for example. This reaches a 23% higher average FPS at 1440p compared to a 4070 laptop. So same VRAM capacity, but the desktop card's more powerful GPU is capable of reaching higher frame rates, despite it being a generation older. And this just means that it's capable of running games at higher settings, which also means it's more likely to use more VRAM and run out. We're not going to get a GPU power increase for gaming laptops until Nvidia's RTX 50 series in 2025. Maybe by that point, we will need more than 8 gigs of VRAM, if the new GPUs are actually powerful enough to give laptops good frame rates at those higher resolutions and higher setting levels. What annoys me is the price for VRAM isn't actually that expensive. We're talking about a spot price of a bit more than $2 for 1GB of GDDR6 memory. So an increase from 8 gigs of VRAM to 12 is less than $10. And while that's not nothing, given RTX 4070 laptops start from $1,000, I think Nvidia should just include it. I know that I and many of you would pay $10 to get a 50% VRAM boost. Heck, make it $20 or $30 so that they can still make some profit margin. Especially with how much Nvidia promotes features like ray tracing and DLSS 3 frame generation, both of which increase the amount of VRAM used, and Nvidia obviously know this. So while I think that 8 gigs of VRAM isn't too bad as far as laptop GPUs go in the current generation, we did see some cases where it becomes a limitation, and if newer games have higher quality textures, then yeah, that's only going to get worse. So hopefully a next-gen RTX 5070 or whatever comes with at least 10, ideally 12 gigs of VRAM. But based on these leaks, that's not going to be the case. The 5070 might still have 8 gigs, but apparently there's something in between the 5070 and 5080 with 12 gigs, while the 5080 gets boosted up to 16 gigs, which is more than the 4080's 12 gigs. We're just going to have to wait and see. But at the end of the day, VRAM clearly isn't that expensive, and Nvidia should just include more. Right now, if you want more than 8 gigs of VRAM, you have to spend more money for an RTX 4080 laptop. So check out this comparison next to see what the differences are in 25 games at 3 different resolutions. I'll see you in that one next.